see.
Okay, it says, please ask the host to give you permission to record. So that's, I think you have to
Okay,
turn
it's on
on.
now. Welcome, everyone. Yes. And today...
At the bottom of your screen, Julia, there should be a thing that says record. Just a
Yes,
button that
we've
says
got it
record.
on now. It's the red button and it's
Oh, there
working.
it is, yes. It's recording now.
And welcome everyone tonight. The Academia Bessarion is talking about pilgrimage and literature, following on from having discussed Dante's Vita Nova and then the 7 Acts of Mercy in Florence. And so I begin with the image of the beautiful villa in a garden in, not going to move, in Rome. And then to recapitulate the 7 Acts of Mercy from the Gospel of Matthew 25, we remember were to feed the hungry, to give water to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, and especially for this session, to shelter the homeless, the stranger, the pilgrim, the other who is ourselves, to visit the sick, to visit the imprisoned, to ransom the captive. And then the one which is not in the gospel, but which I was even doing this morning, is to bury the dead, because I am custodian of a cemetery. We talked about the Buon Uomini di San Martino, the little chapel right by Dante's house, with the frescoes of the 7 Acts of Mercy. And this is the one for greeting the pilgrims. And I love the detail with the glasses and the ceramic jugs and so forth. The wonderful word in Italian for jug is brocca, which I really like. There are 4 great medieval pilgrimages. The one to Jerusalem was already the Hebrew pilgrimage, which was carried out at Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, in memory of the Exodus for freedom from slavery in Egypt. And then, with the loss of Jerusalem, the Roman Church emphasizes the Jubilees to Rome, and this is the setting of Dante's Commedia in 1300. Then we had also the Compostela Pilgrimage, which is really to counter the Muslim Hajj, and to St. James, the brother of Christ, the Bishop of Jerusalem, is magically transported without his head to Compostela, to Spain. And the stories begin in the 7th century. But it becomes excellent propaganda for the Reconquista of Spain. And then the 4th one, the major one, is St. Thomas Becket, amongst many, many others. And so we have the pilgrimages to relics, visiting relics. They also built large churches because the pilgrims would sleep in the churches overnight in the presence of the shrine of the saint, to have dreams of this. And this goes back to the Greek practice at Aesculapius's temple at Epidavros, where there was also the huge theatre. They would go into the temple and dream of Aesculapius appearing to them, or of his serpents on the caduceus. And it became an act of piety to give lodging to the pilgrims. And Florence was filled with hospitals. The word originally means, I'm even on this spoken of in the Italian version as the hospite of this Zoom meeting. The host and the guest, the words are the same. They mirror each other. Pilgrimages were done out of penance. If you had committed a murder, you could have chains into which were forged the weapons you had used, and you would go on pilgrimage like Cain until the chains fell off and you were exonerated. You could, pilgrims could be criminals, murderers, or saints. It was a very inclusive realm without hierarchies, and also the image of exile, which is very much important in Dante's life. For the Compostela, we don't quite know why they chose the shell, but it's a beautiful symbol which was placed on the pilgrims' hats. And you see first the pilgrims' hats are conical, like this one of the pilgrim in a mural on Tavan on the way to Compostela. He's got the palm of the Jericho pilgrimage, the baston, the staff, and the hat. And then you've got a whole plethora of these pewter and lead pilgrim badges. You can see the shell, you can see Thomas Becket, you can see here you've got the vernicle, which is the Veronica veil in Rome, and the shell on this side, and so forth. And here's a later pilgrim hat with many of the shell of the emblems. In Piers Plowman, the Palmer, who is a false Palmer, who doesn't know who St. Truth is, who is, of course, Christ, but his hat is just laden with lead images. And also the wife of Bath is similar. It's important in medieval art to put on the mind of Christ, to imagine yourself in contemplation as is this woman and as this monk or friar Dominican. This is painted by Fra Angelico. You, in this painting, you become Christ, and you feel the blows against you by these hands, which you can't see because you're blindfolded, but you do feel also the spit on your cheek. You feel this corporeally on your body. And it's important in this kind of art that to realize that it collapses time and space into the present moment, here and now. We tend to do historical dramas in the past. Florentine painting was painting the figures in their moment in time. The Ghirlandaio are actually portraits of Florentines present at the Epiphany, which is tomorrow, and so forth. So, in a sense, the pilgrimage is to do the imitation of Christ, to go into the exile into Egypt as a child, and so forth. And this kind of contemplation one can do in one's cell in Britain. This is what Jerome said. You can just as easily reach heaven from your cell in Britain as you can on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So you have Julian of Norwich in her cell. She doesn't do pilgrimages, but perhaps her alter ego is encouraged by her, Marjorie Kemp, to do the pilgrimages, which in a sense are imitations of Birgitta of Sweden, and we'll come back to that. The pilgrim dressed in the sklavin of fleece. This goes back to John the Baptist, it goes back to the Old Testament prophets, and it will be continued with the Desert Fathers. And here you have Christ with the pilgrim shell on his scrip. Here he is being greeted by two, this is again for our Angelico, two Dominicans. And this photograph was actually bought by the nuns of my community, who would be sent by the mother foundress, Agnes Mason, Anglican, to India by way of Florence, where they would buy Alinari photographs. This is back in the 19th century, and I have these Alinari photographs. Alinari doesn't have them because they were destroyed in the flood, and I was able to bring them back to Florence. This is in Pistoia, and it's the chapel where you see the pilgrim with the shell on his hat, and you see Christ having his feet washed, when this is a reversal of Christ washing the feet of his disciples. You will get these games of reversals in this text. And then I did the pilgrimages after having written my doctoral dissertation, thesis in English, on pilgrimage in Dante, Langland and Chaucer. Before I entered my convent, I splurged on going with the Italians, hosted by the Franciscans, who are the custodians of the holy places, to go to Mount Sinai, because that is Monte Purgatory. It's also modeled on Monte Cecere outside of Florence, but at the same time, those terraces are what the pilgrims climb. This is my watercolor of the scene. At dawn, we saw on the top of Mount Sinai this vast desert around us, and then we celebrated Mass. This is with the Spanish bishop, the Mexican priests, and on the mountain with us, there were a family from Egypt, all dressed in their sacred green, doing the pilgrimage, the Muslim pilgrimage, because it's a holy place for Muslims and Christians. There were Australians. There were a group of elderly ladies, all with staffs, from Greece. And the leader was called Dionysia. And it was a wonderful sense on the top of this mountain. There were no barriers between us. It was very ecumenical. No Jews, because they know we've got the wrong mountain. Helena made a mistake, and which it doesn't matter. It's the sort of the willing suspension of disbelief. And then you come down the mountain. We should have actually gone up. We went the wrong way. And at these gates, the monks used to hear the confessions of the pilgrims. And this is the scene that you have in Dante's Purgatory. And I was able to photograph it going to the arch and then having come from it. And these are 19th century illustrations of St. Catherine's Monastery, nestled at the bottom of the mountain. And then to get to the holy places, the Shepherd's Field in Bethlehem. I was there, well, it was almost 30 years ago, but it was as if one walked into the pages of the Bible. It was extraordinary. It wasn't a touristy thing at all. It was so real. And this is medieval illumination of the pilgrims. You can see them here, contemplating at Bethlehem the birth. Well, she hasn't yet born the child, Joseph at her side, the shepherds with the Annunciation to the angels. And so you get this extraordinary sense of what happened 2,000 years ago, happening in the 14th century, happening in the 20th and 21st. This is the basilica that Helena built at Bethlehem. And she also designed the door to be so small that horses couldn't enter it. So it never got destroyed. And underneath is the cave, the grotto. Next to it is the one where Jerome, Paula, and Eustachian were translating the Bible into Latin. And the night we were there, this is where the star is on the floor, it's here. And this Palestinian family came with their newborn baby, a daughter. And this is the Mexican priest. And there we all are. We asked if we could take their photograph, and they immediately lined up formally. We had wanted to do it informally. Also, the pilgrims went to Jordan and bathed in the water. And you can see one of them with his pilgrim hat still on. Oh, sorry. This is the shroud. The Russian pilgrims were still doing this in the beginning of the 20th century, taking their shrouds and washing them in the Jordan and carrying them back home to be used for their burials. And then this is a drawing by Adamnan at the dictation by Arkulf of what the Constantinian Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre had been like. And he was a shipwrecked Gaulish bishop, Arkulf, who ended up on the island of Iona dictating the description of the holy places to Adamnan, the abbot. And then here we have the pilgrims arriving at the Holy Sepulchre in the 14th century. And here you get the Muslim key keeper of the door. And that practice is still going on. Here we are. And the sisters at the back are the Florentine sisters. One of them is named Sister Peregrina. And I was traveling with them, and then I ended up being their neighbor here in Florence. They have their monastery down the street. And one time when I lost my keys, they took me in overnight, and they're wonderful. But here you have the ceremony of the doors, which we watched, where the family from the 17th century, and then a second family with Saladin in 1187, they have the right to make sure that the doors are locked at night. Some of the priests and monks stay inside, and the tourists ourselves were outside. In 1217, St. Francis was given custody of the holy places by the Sultan of Babylon, and eventually the Franciscans were able to acquire much of the Holy Sepulchre, but it's also shared with Armenians and so on. And it was only being closed in 1348 at the time of the Black Death, and in March 2020 because of COVID-19. And next to it, and I loved being a pilgrim in Jerusalem because the sense of each group protects the others. Here you've got the carpets from the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, and here is the Dome of the Rock. And this was actually built by Christian architects for the Muslims from Byzantium. And then you have also churches like the Church of the Ascension is now a mosque, but this is the place where Christ's feet had stood. And then the stone of that is meant to be in Westminster Abbey with the footprints. That's sort of one of the pilgrim relics. Many women went on pilgrimage. Helena was very much responsible for beginning this whole in 327, and the description of her is fascinating because, well, I think I'll turn to the map. I had to go to Google and create a map because I couldn't find one that includes America, Iceland, England, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, and Israel. And then I did a drawing of it. And what we have here is Helena in 327. The legend is that she is a slave from York who has Constantine as her son. She's repudiated by Constans, the father, and then Constantine creates her as the empress. And she would go about the streets dressed poorly, without bodyguards. She would rescue the prisoners in the salt mines. She did many acts of mercy. She climbed Mount Sinai, which she identified as being Mount Sinai. She also was, later the legend is that she raises the true cross and so forth. Egeria is a Spanish woman pilgrim, possibly, who journeys from Spain to Mount Sinai. And she describes the dawn from the top of Mount Sinai, which I then, many years later, also saw. And then she goes to Jerusalem, she observes all of the liturgical rituals, she goes to Constantinople, and she writes letters back home to the nuns in Spain or near the Atlantic Ocean. And then you've got Paula and Eustachian, who give up all of their wealth to go to be with Jerome, to fund his translation of the Vulgate, and also to study Hebrew. They already had Greek as well as Latin, in order to help with the translation. And the medieval copies of the Vulgate always had the letters prefacing the books of the Bible. Those have now been thrown out, and Kelly's biography of Jerome never mentions Paula and Eustochium, and without them we wouldn't have had Roman Christianity in the mode that we do. And then there's Pega. She's from Cambridge, Fens. Her brother is Guthlac, and she is a lovely story about it. My convent actually owned her hermitage in the Cambridge Fens. She travels to Rome, and when she gets there, all of the bells start ringing. And I would love to believe that. And I loved going with one of my students, Phil Roughton, invited me, and Anja is also a good friend of his, invited me to Iceland in the year 2000, when they were celebrating 1,000 years of Christianity. They had voted in their parliament, the all thing, to all become Christian in the year 1000. The all thing is held outdoors at the Thingvellir. And Jonas Christiansen, who is the great scholar at the Arne Magnuson Institute, told me about Guthritha. Guthritha went to Greenland from Iceland and then to Vinland, where she bore a child. And then she came back to Iceland. From her descended 3 bishops, and then she went on pilgrimage to Rome. And this is around the year 1000. Then you have another Bridget of Ireland, not the famous one, but she and her brother Andrea end up in Fiesole. And also with them is their friend St. Donatus, also from Ireland, who writes in a beautiful manuscript I've seen in the Laurentian Library, a poem in Latin in which he describes St. Bridget, the real one, putting her wet cloak on a sunbeam to dry. And it's so enchanting. And then you've got Margaret of Jerusalem. She was actually born in Jerusalem to her parents from Beverley, who were on pilgrimage there. And then they bring her back home, and then she decides to go back to Jerusalem when she's grown up, and she's raised the brother because her parents had died. And she actually fights in the siege of Jerusalem with a cook pot on her head. And her brother, when she's coming back, and he's by that point a monk in France, he writes her story in Latin verse, and it's enchanting. And I put it into our book on medieval pilgrims. And then Birgitta of Sweden, she's from Uppsala. She founds her abbey in Vadstena. She comes in the Jubilee year to Rome. And then she'd already done the pilgrimage to Compostela. Her poor husband was sort of forced to do it, and she wanted to vow poverty, chastity, and so forth. And eventually he dies, and she is freed to become a very major political figure, supporting the church against the threat of the Reformation. And she writes this horrendous book. One of the books in that book is the Book of Pilgrimages, where she describes also going to Bethlehem and to Jerusalem, where she has visions. And the vision she has in Bethlehem is of the Madonna laying the baby on the bare earth, which then changes Western art. So this is the way the Nativity is shown, with the child laid on the earth, and we'll come to examples of that. Then we've got Marjorie Kemp, who copies all of Birgitta's pilgrimages to Compostela, to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, to Cologne, to Aachen, and gets up all the way to Norway, and so on and so forth, and ends up coming to Sion in London. And Alice of Bath is Chaucer's satire on all of these women, undoing our sanctity by presenting a pilgrim who is the exact opposite of what a pilgrim should be. And then I had also done them. But it's a vast space. And then here is Birgitta. Okay, let's see if we can go back. Here is Birgitta as a widow. Here she is as a pilgrim. And there's a cluster of pilgrims here. This one is the one with the hat. There he is. And then this is her vision in the cave in Bethlehem, where the Virgin lays the baby on the ground. And Birgitta is in the cave, contemplating this as if it were happening in her moment in time. And she describes it so clearly. that the painters, including Chiara Gambacorta, whose father was actually with Brigitte on this pilgrimage in the Holy Land, she commissions this painting, which is in Pisa. And then we talked about the Portanare Altarpiece, which was commissioned by Tommaso Portanare, descended from Folco Portanare e Beatrice, who was his daughter. This was painted in Bruges by Hugo van der Goes for the Ospedale degli Innocenti, which we discussed last time. But you can see the baby laid on the ground, vulnerable. The baby is also ourselves as well as Christ. Then that was the physical forms. Those were the physical forms of pilgrimages. But at the same time, there was this wonderful play in literature. There's a splendid Irish lyric saying, if you go to Rome, it's of no use unless Christ had traveled with you. Then you have in the 13th century this magnum opus, the Roman de la Rose, which is really a wet dream. You get visions, dream visions, but partly because of the ritual of incubating in the churches, sleeping overnight to have the vision of the saint who would cure you of your illnesses, with miracles. Then we had Dante, the Vita Nuova, using the Exodus and Emmaus themes, the 42 stations of Exodus, the 42 chapters, and the Commedia. Langland's Piers Plowman, which is a poem I love. Chaucer in Troilus and Crusader mentions that pilgrims had this sort of sanctuary right. They could go cross enemy lines. They could have even walked through our COVID lockdowns because they sort of had this special privilege that they were of the other world, not of this world. They laid worldliness aside. Then you had the Canterbury Tales, which is wonderful satire, because pilgrims were not meant to be on horseback. That would invalidate the pilgrimage. Only an ass might be allowed because Christ had only ridden on an ass. And then we have the feminist poem, Chemin de Longitude by Christine de Bizan, who has this wonderful dream vision which she rewrites as a feminist form of the Commedia. Central to the concept of pilgrimage is that of God in everyone. Christ is the stranger, and that the pilgrim has this very important diplomatic immunity. He had to have paid all his debts before he set forth. He'd have to have documents permitting him to go on pilgrimage, like a passport. But he was exempt from taxes and so forth during that pilgrimage, except from the Muslims. And he would have to take money to pay for the passage and so on. And also, these works all tend to be autobiographies, but they're sort of fictional autobiographies. The poet puts himself into the poem and becomes a lay figure for you, the reader, and you experience the pilgrimage through him as he is doing his Imitatio Christi. He begins by making lots of mistakes to teach you how not to make those mistakes. And then he eventually will have attained a sense of being purged of his sins, and you too with him. These are not like military epics or foundation legends. It's the opposite of the martial, aristocratic, historical epic. And I found it fascinating that in the 14th century, Dante, with his exile, the trauma, and then with the plague, they came up with this particular form, which is very, very powerful. It's psychiatry in the sense of a whole people. This is the way Piers Plowman is written, with the sense of it being Julian of Norwich's Even Christians. And we talked about the Vita Nuova having the Exodus theme. And Dante will use this as, let's see if I can get it. It's not playing the music. Oh, I hope I don't lose it. Okay. Sorry. It's not. Forgive me on this. Psalm 113 is sung to the tonus peregrinus. And I think we've walked into somebody's, let's see if we can find, oh, and help. And there we are, we're back. Presentation and Dalinitia. And okay, now we've got to quickly go. Sorry about this technical problem. I was going to be able to play for you Psalm 113 with the tonus peregrinus, which even James Joyce puts into Ulysses. And it's Dante says he bases the Commedia. There we are. Mm-hmm. Okay, now we can. It's rather monotonous. It's very, very early music, which Dante actually does a kind of historiography of music in the correct chronological order in the Purgatory, beginning with Psalm 113, which had been sung by the Hebrew pilgrims going to the temple, and then progressing through Gregorian chant, and then ending with polyphony. And then also the other model for the story is the Emmaus story of the two pilgrims greeting the third. Let's see if we can do this one. And my Luke in this, she's a very lovely young Mexican singer who was here in Florence. And they're singing Amor et Desiderium, love and desire. It's a hymn which Dante in the beginning of the Vita Nuova is using as lustfully, and then Beatrice dies and she becomes the figure of Christ. And then the play is acted in Gregorian chant. I used to have my students, we found in 5 rehearsals, they could sing the Latin Gregorian chant, and it was a wonderful introduction to these texts. This is the Bury St. Edmunds drawings of the Peregrini, the pilgrims to Emmaus. And let's see if I can, okay.
Julia, we've lost your screen share. Or at least
Okay, right.
But we're
Thank
not
you. Thank you. I need this. Right. Okay.
loving
Right.
this.
But is it back?
Yes, it says you started
Okay.
screen.
This is the
Thank you so much.
sculpture at Selos. Luke is carrying the book of the gospel. We don't think of that third pilgrim any longer as Luke, but in the medieval tradition, he is chided by Christ, oh fool and stupid, how can't you recognize that I'm with you? You're slow of heart to believe. And he is actually the gospeler, but in the text, he's stupid. He doesn't know the story when he is the writer of the story. So you get this wonderful doubleness, which is also the game that Dante is playing, Come ne Luca scriva, where he doesn't understand the story when he's in it, but the author outside the text does. And this play of Amor et Desiderium, love as Cupid, love as Christ, the two worlds. I use this sculpture for my book on pilgrimage because it's so splendid. Let's see if we can go on to the next one. Okay, now it seems to, okay. Here again, you've got, and the Selos Monastery, it's a Benedictine monastery on the road to Compostela. On this roof, you get stories of Renard de Fox, whereas here, the other pillar, the other side of this pillar has the Selos, Peregrini. This is the doubting of Thomas, placing his hand in the wounds of Christ. the magnificent sculptures. The monks during Lent did not shave, so they grew beards. And they acted these plays in Gregorian chant in Latin. And especially they had the oblates participate, because that was an excellent way for them to learn Gregorian chant and Latin. In pilgrimage, there's always this doubleness, the ambages, pulcherime ambages, which Virgil and Dante speak about, the ambiguities. By its contrary is everything declared, Chaucer says. This is a sense that we moderns have lost. But in Luke 24, in the Latin, dum fabula rentio, while they're telling fables, they are also listening to Christ's hic sermones, the sermons, fables and sermons, which is the structuring of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And is also playing off dearly beloved. As strangers and pilgrims, I beseech you, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, which is very difficult to do. I mean, I found manuscripts, for instance, in Bavaria, where the monks were having to read about how to avoid having wet dreams and so on and so forth, which is rather comic. But anyway, how should I your true love know? From another one, by his cockle hat and staff and his sandal shoon. This is Shakespeare, Hamlet having Ophelia say this. Here is a Minnesanga manuscript where the lover, the male, is so prostrate in love with the lady that he disguises himself as a pilgrim and journeys to her. There she is with her lapdog in her arms, and he presents to her his love poetry. And also this gets into the Tristan and Isolde, where Tristan is a pilgrim. There are three pilgrims who meet outside Tintagel. These are tiles in a Benedictine Chertsey monastery. Then here you've got Tristan helps Isolde from the barge. So she is able to say truthfully, and he's disguised as a pilgrim. She's able to say truthfully to Mark and to survive the trial by ordeal that she has lain in no man's arms save those of Mark and that pilgrim who is Tristan. So she was telling the truth. Roman de Renard, you get Renard, Benin and Bernard, the fox, the sheep and the ass, as pilgrims imitating Christ, Luke and Cleophas at Emmaus, the Renaderie. Renard has decided he's going to repent of his sins and go to Rome to be forgiven. But he meets Belen and Bernard, and they end up in an inn, and they get so drunk that they never get to Rome. And then the whole Roman de la Rose is this parody of sanctity, except in the inner vision, you get the wonderful vision of the peaceable kingdom, the shepherd, the sheep, and so forth in a lovely garden. In a sense, we need here to think of pilgrimage literature as dealing with the trickster savior sense of first the experiencing of sin and then the redemption from it. And also the two worlds of Bakhtin, who was the Russian scholar who was in serious trouble with the Soviets, but who talked about how the sacred Latin world was in the vernacular world. They played with it. They did the sort of photographic negative of it. And then you also have Petrarch in his sonnet 16, where the old man with his grey hair, dressed in the fleece, with the Compostela shell, is journeying to see the Veronica Vale in Rome. And Petrarch compares this to his own, which is like the Minnesinger Johannes van Hadlab, his own love for Laura, where Dante with Beatrice, Petrarch with Laura, and so forth. But then you come to this wonderful Irish lyric, which is in the Sedulius manuscript. And Danuta, I found today looking up Sedulius that you had published on him. And it's who pilgrims to Rome labours much, yet little gains. Your king is there only if he travelled with you. And Ireland gives Europe rhyming poetry, purgatory, and the great importance of penitential pilgrimage, re-Christianizing Europe with her great learning, the British Isles, even fiercely with the free pilgrims from Ireland who show up there, who Christianize this part of Tuscany. And the Irish had the free forms of martyrdoms, the red, where you were killed, bloodshed, the blue-green, where you go on pilgrimage, and the white of staying in your monastery. Skellig Michael and St. Patrick's Purgatory are all part of this. And then I talked about the Selos sculpture with Luke and Cleophas and Christ. But also in the Dante manuscripts, you have Dante holding the Aeneid, which will turn into the Gospel. Next, he's young, next to Cleophas, who's old. The reason why we had a woman sing the part of Luke in our presentation of the Peregrini, the Officium Peregrinorum, was because the music can only be sung by a boy or a woman. It's too high for and to differentiate the ages. And Dante is shown in the illuminations to the Commedia as the apprentice, as the learner, as the student. And Virgil is his teacher, Brunetto is his teacher. And then this is an episode in the Inferno, in the area of the robbers, the thieves, Filippo Argenti. And actually, Filippo Argenti, Brunetto, in his very last act in the Comune, involves Filippo Argenti. He's a real flesh and blood person. He stole the silver from this altar of St. James, and Spain so recognizes Pistoria's relationship with St. James that it even used the statue in the center of the altar for its jubilee of the Compostela Pilgrimage. And then this is Piers Plowman, this is the Palmer, who doesn't know, has never heard tell of St. Truth, but he's journeyed everywhere. And then you also have the wife of Bath, who's similar. And sometimes I feel that perhaps I'm like her. There she is with her big pilgrim hat. And you also have the pardoner, who has his scrip hanging around the horse's neck, which is another wonderful joke because the pilgrims could not ride on horseback. And then you have the feminist commedia, where you get Christine and the Sibyl. She's young, Sibyl is old, which is like Luke and Cleophas. The Sibyl is teaching Christine all about it's a parody. Well, it's a feminist version of Dante's Commedia, Le Chemin de Longitude, and I've misspelled chemin. But we've published it, we've translated it into Italian. It had never been in Italian before. She was Italian. She went as a young girl to the court of France with her father as the king's astrologer. And she was given as a child the run of the King's Library in Paris. So she was reading all of the classics and also Dante and Boccaccio and so forth. And she writes these wonderful dream visions. The dream vision is a very useful literary form because it doesn't have to be literal. Dreams aren't. So you can play games with them. But it's not necessarily a literal dream that the dreamer has. It's a fiction. And this is what Pietro Allegri says in his commentary to his father's Commedia, that this is a fiction to teach the truth, that you can use this opposition. And also it's a text about the physical body. The author's body is real, and you see him both outside and inside the text. And it's a product of the mind, but it's about the soul. Also, pilgrimage is very lay. It's not, except for Guillaume de Guilville, it's not written by priests, ecclesiasts. It's written by lay people who are constructing a form of Christianity which will be more palatable, more like the gospel, sort of pre-Reformation in a way. I've misspelled democratic. It's very democratic, the form of pilgrimage. Dante, in fact, gets sort of chastised by Beatrice when he's talking with Cataguida, and he suddenly becomes very involved with his ancestry as being aristocratic. Ahem, says Beatrice. This is not true to the gospel. And when he gets to the rose, it's an equal number of men with women of the Old Testament, the New Testament. Everyone is equally with God. And when he looks at the face of God, it seems to him as if painted in our image. Suddenly, all the distinctions of rank are gone. And then also in pilgrimage literature, there's this doubleness of sacred and profane, pilgrimage and anti-pilgrimage, because true pilgrimage doesn't need to be the physical pilgrimage. That's not enough, like the Palmer in Piers Plowman. I shouldn't have gone and done all the physical pilgrimages I did. I'm glad I did. But I realized when I went into the convent, I had to give all my pilgrim badges away. I had to strip myself of all of that and give it up. I wasn't any longer in that lay world. And then it's important to remember the Emmaus and Exodus paradigms that all of these writers use. And the sense of time and eternity, space and time are very important. The author pilgrim autobiography mirrors the everyman reader, but also the author incarnates himself within his text, first as Adam, doing the imitatio Christi, and you with him, so that you put on the mind of Christ through these profane works which become sacred. And the space is global, it mirrors the cosmos and the creator. Cristoforo Landino says that Dante is writing the poem of the Commedia the way God creates the creation. And also, I think in terms of the response to trauma, exile, plague, COVID-19, it's an ordering, returning to a world that makes sense, that has justice when it seems to have shattered. And so I've sort of placed here Victor Turner was this splendid anthropologist who was doing field work in Africa amongst the Nimbu, and who was realizing that rituals were very important. He'd been communist, and he was very important in advising during the ecumenical council. And he was saying that pilgrimage is an area where all of the ranks break down, if everything becomes equal. So I've sort of sensed that these were the people I used in my dissertation to try to understand this genre, which I found to be so exciting. And then I love William Blake. This is the gate, the Golden Gate of the walls that Suleiman built for Jerusalem, which the Muslims have blocked because the legend is that when Jesus goes through these gates, this will be the apocalypse. William Blake writes, I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. And so these are the books I've written on pilgrimage. And it's a fascinating topic. It goes beyond what normal literary studies do, because you have to see the author outside, the figure within the text, and so on. And this is the bibliography. Now it's time for all of us to talk. I'm sorry I talked too long. Can you all unmute and participate. And let's see if I can end the condivisione. And here's Malcolm. Malcolm, could you begin? Yes.
Oh, well, thank you, Julia. That was a tour de force. There's so many beautiful things to come into that, and I was glad that Cambridge got a mention, and a pilgrim from Cambridge. Maybe I could just to sort of stir in the literary thing a little bit. Obviously, in the Reformation in England, there was this sort of terrible
We
diktat
ended
whereby
it, right? We threw the
had been
baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, well, exactly. And a nation that had been on pilgrimage was told not to go on pilgrimage. But what's really interesting from a literary point of view is how the metaphor of pilgrimage was so deeply embedded in
Yes.
the whole thing about you could be in your cell and go anywhere. Funnily enough, that early Catholic. So you get Walter Raleigh writing A Passionate Man's Pilgrimage.
Yes. Yes.
Give me my staff of faith to lean upon, my script, my bottle of salvation, and I will make my pilgrimage. And then you get George Herbert writing a poem about pilgrimage, but also saying that that prayer is the soul in pilgrimage, the heart in
the
pilgrimage.
one I love is Raleigh.
Yeah, the Raleigh one is wonderful. And then, of course,
Yes.
you get Bunyan. And when I was working on George Herbert, I came to realize that, that Bunyan had, in fact, read Herbert, and that probably Herbert's pilgrimage poems, influenced Bunyan.
Wonderful,
So,
yes.
Fun, I thought I might just throw into the mix. My last published book of poems is called After Prayer, and I wrote a sequence of sonnets on each of the phrases in George Herbert's poem Prayer. And one of those phrases is, of course, heart in pilgrimage. And so many things were resonating for me as you did your thing. So I just thought I may have to disappear fairly soon, but I thought I might just share this one for a bit of fun. It's a sonnet, so it's only 14 lines, only takes a minute to read. But so many of your pilgrims actually get a name check in this poem, although I hadn't seen.
Right.
So here is a little sonnet which is written in terza rima, you'll be happy to know. It's called Heart in Pilgrimage. I start with Dante in a darkened wood, well past the middle of my mazy way. My beating heart sustains this flesh and blood, a sounding drum that will not let me stay stuck in the sluggishness of middle age. For here are April showers and a new day, as Chaucer joins me in my pilgrimage. The mottled glory of his company with all their tales to tell gives me new courage. And now a Bedford tinker comes to me and sings, here little and hereafter bliss, death wears thy sting, where grave thy victory. So, pilgrim heart,
yes,
beating, fierce and free, your last beat brings me where I long to be.
Yes. Thank you. And now, because we're on pilgrimage and everyone is equal, can we please see how we can get all of the others into the images?
I think with gallery view you can.
Right.
I've got 16 people on my screen, and there are 16
right.
people.
I don't have them. I don't know how to do that.
Okay. Just go to the upper right, and you'll press view, and you press gallery.
Gallery.
I meant to talk about Monogund, and her miracles were so typical of the ones of Thomas Becket and so on and so forth. And those wonderful stained glass windows in Canterbury. What I find fascinating, one of the miracles in the Canterbury stained glass windows, the plague comes to this family, and it's a very wealthy Norman English family, the Fitzezels, the sons of Zulfs and so on, and which is why the Irish have the Fitz in their names, because they're the Normans that went to Ireland. And the nurse Bretonwy dies. Now Bretonwy, she's Celtic. She's the slave in the family. And then Gimp the leper tells the family that if they don't take the gifts to Thomas Becket's shrine in time, the son will die. And he begins to be ill, so they haste to the shrine with all of the gifts. And then there's another story of there's a wonderful Merck's Vestal where he's preaching and telling pilgrims fables. And one of them is of the family that stay at an inn, and the innkeeper plays a trick on them and pretends that the boy has stolen 2 golden flagons, and they find them in the luggage, and he's about to be hanged. The parents go to St. James to pray for his life. They come back to the inn and they find that although he's been hanged by the rope, St. James has held him up and he's still alive. And these extraordinary stories were part of the Unbuckle Thy Maul, Chaucer says, and to tell all the stories. Now, we need somebody else also to
This is
I wish I could see all the faces. Yes, Alex, right.
Yes. Among the things that I love about this book is the maps that you actually provide of women, these early women. So many of, when we think of pilgrimage, obviously families did this, but it was largely male. And I think that your chapters on these women, I mean, Egeria, who just did this incredible geographic trek.
They were splendid, right?
But also I want to add one other thing is that one of my favorites that I have not reread in years is Felix Fabry.
Yes. Now that's an unusual one because the clergy were not meant to do pilgrimages, and he is clergy. But the stories are wonderful.
It's so gossipy. It really is. It's gossipy in the way that it's like Yelp reviews. It's like, oh, here is where, they put things in our boots as we slept at night, or they did whatever. And talking about the commerce of pilgrimage.
Right. Venice especially, which gets into the simile of the arsenal in the Inferno, because that's where the pilgrim ships were caulked with so that they wouldn't sink on the journey to Jerusalem, to Jaffa. And all of those are physical details which get into the fiction, but they're facts. So this is what I find wonderful about pilgrimage literature. It's so incarnational. It's playing gospel games in its own moment in time. The Bible and the gospel, they begin in the beginning was the word. But in Dante, it's nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. It's the rewriting of the gospel in Florence and so forth. And so we really need a different definition of this genre. It's neither fact nor fiction, but it's both. It's playing all kinds of paradoxical games. And that's why I found it was so important to read the pilgrim texts about the physical pilgrimages and to do it at the same time as a backdrop to the literary texts about that. At the same time that the literary texts were also saying, no, you don't need to do the physical pilgrimages. So it sort of deconstructs.
Of course, sadly, none of us.
Yes.
Now. Yeah.
I would love more voices.
Julia?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Right.
Julia, can you see?
I can see you, yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for offering this. And it's just wonderful to be here with you. So I can't let the moment go by without asking you some things rather than adding my own thoughts and comments. I'll just say that I'm a pilgrim writer. And I would like you to talk some more, if you would, about the genre structure that you laid out as the dream vision, it's lay writers, sacred profane, those things. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Right. It seems as though all across Europe during this period, they form these major texts in 3 parts. Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. De Guilville is Jésus-Christ de l'âme, etc. There's three versions in the Pèlerinage. And so on and so forth. Chaucer, the general prologue, the tales, the sermon. And with Langland, it's do well, do bet, and do best. So they're using the Trinity. They're lay people doing excellent theology. Also, they're writing confession manuals in which we participate. But they're sort of like Pinocchio, Carlo Collodi, where we make all of the mistakes that Pinocchio does, and then eventually learn how not to be such an ass, and so on. And this is the game that's from the Emmaus theme, the way Luke writes it in the Gospel. Where in the way the medieval readers read Luke's gospel as having that playfulness of being chided for being so stupid and so on and so forth. And this is why I wish we could teach these texts this way, because they actually, with the laughter, they are deeper than, if you Racine, who is so serious, he doesn't have the joyfulness or the actual empathy and healing that a Molière play has, where Molière will have Dorine save the whole family from the hypocrite, and the king sending the message, and so forth. That's real playfulness, whereas Racine's seriousness ends up being rather superficial, doesn't go far enough. I don't know if this makes sense, but this is why I loved working with these texts. And I don't remember, in the Via Veritatis, the great fresco painting with St. Birgitta and the Pilgrim, and the very far left is a figure in red. He's Jewish, with a pointed hat, which also the pilgrims wore because they were being Jews in doing the Exodus and so forth. But he's tearing pages out of a book, which is like the wife of Bath tearing the pages out of her clerkly husband's book, in which he has sort of written a kind of misogynist Bible, that Eve is the one who begins all of the problems and so on and so forth. And so there's this kind of self-referential playfulness within the text. Remember, Trajan in Piers Plowman says, "Yea, bore for books," and they deconstruct themselves with laughter, which I think ends up creating a greater depth and a greater learning, because they are capable of not taking themselves so seriously.
It's like the laughter at the end of Troilus and Crusade as well, when there's a sort of laughter coming down.
I lip read. I'm sorry.
At the end of Troilus and Crusader, of Chaucer's Troilus and Crusader.
Yes.
Laughter coming down.
Right. Yes. Well, this is what we said when we did the Vita Nova, that these texts palinode. They seem to go in one direction, and then they split and they go in the opposite. And with Troilus and Crusader, you get all of this, the Petrarch and Lady Cruel but Fair, and all of this silly stuff that goes on with the Pandarus and so on. And then you get Troilus's vision, which is from the Sondi and Scipionis and from Dante. And it's completely reversed. And that's also, it's said in the Tristan that the story is like the sleeve turned inside out, which is, these are texts which are like sleeves turned inside out and reversed and so forth. But I don't know how can you pin this down, because it's not a normal genre. It's not the novel, it's not the epic, it's not the sonnet. All of that at once. Portmanteau.
I'd just like to say that it's
Yes.
not just the genre that really needs to be unpacked, but the experience of pilgrimage as well. I mean, which is
Yes.
enormously varied. I mean, the sort of literary sort of modes that you were talking about are mostly like pilgrimage as a purely spiritual sort of
Hmm.
goal that doesn't have to result in travel. But if you
Yes.
want to cure, which a lot of like all the sort of glass in Canterbury, like those were all, most of those were cures. And you did need to go to Canterbury to get the cure. It was a very different sort of pilgrimage. And then there was Egeria, and I think as well Felix Fabry, who went to the Holy Land in order to understand the Gospels better. I mean, to be where they had taken place, so that they could, well, in Felix Fabry's case, so he could make better sermons. Uh, there were
Yes.
enormously different
Hmm.
motivations for pilgrimage.
And certainly, I found this on the pilgrimage I did with the Italians. The person who was always, we always had to sleep in the same room. She was looking for a husband, and, and it was, and then she got terrible tummy problems on Sinai, and I was having to look after her. But I was bound and determined to climb Mount Sinai. So I'm afraid I abandoned her at that point, and she recovered all right. But and there was a nun also who was going into all of the jewelry shops to buy gold and so on and so forth. And it was a wonderful experience. And then I got into awful trouble with the customs, with the Israeli police, who couldn't understand why I was traveling with Italians, because I was, American English. And I finally had to show them my book on the pilgrimage to explain why I had done this, because to them it didn't make sense. And I looked to them like a spy or something. And so it wasn't, it was, I'm very glad I did it, because that experience of being on top of Mount Sinai was extraordinary, even though we all knew it was the wrong mountain.
Yeah, I'm being called away, but I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this, and I wish I could stay longer for the discussion, but many, many thanks. It's great to.
Yes. I wanted to talk a bit about this. This is a book by Stephen Graham, with the Russian pilgrims to Jerusalem, and it's published just before the Communist Revolution. And they are actually taking their shrouds and washing them in the Jordan. They are doing everything that was already being done in the Middle Ages. And he had a Brownie box camera, and he takes wonderful photographs of them. It's a splendid book. And this is what I found so fascinating about it, that it's so timeless. It's 2,000 years collapsed into one person's life, uh, which the condensation of it is, and it's, well, I just wish I could get more people to get excited and interested in this whole exploration, because of that sort of duality of reality and the um, fantasy through the dream vision and so forth. Now, I want to hear from more of the people we've got. I don't see this. Yeah,
Maybe I can say something,
good.
and thank you for invitation. And as a human from Russia, I can add some things that really I'm interested in, because what do we know about Russian pilgrimage literature from the same time as Dante lived and Brigitte of Sweden, and what if maybe um, maybe from that book that you just shown of Russian pilgrimage on the early 20th century, but connected with each other. And for example, we can find some strange I don't know what we call this strange, I don't know, controversially between fiction and reality in some pilgrimage texts in Russia, and we can find a story about Swedish king Magnus Eriksson, which lived in the same time as Birgitta Sveden, and we know that he died in the sea. During very strong political time in Sweden. But um, in Russia, in the same time, in very important shrine in Russia, maybe it's such important as Santiago and Compostela, and it's a place where was murdered Becket. This place near contemporary St. Petersburg, it called San Valaam. Maybe someone of you heard about this place. And in the time when Magnus Eriksson died, near Valaam was found that some strange person who called himself uh, as a King Magnus Eriksson. And he became a monk in this monastery, in this cloister of Saint Valaam. And it seems like end of his crusade. Uh, you know, this Swedish king was in crusade against Novgorod. It's in the confessional things. They tried to, with Birgitta of Sweden, they tried to converse Novgorodians to Catholicism from Orthodox Greek Church. And now these Orthodox Greek Church monks in Valaam wrote some interesting texts called as Testimony of King Magnus, and he finished his crusade as a pilgrimage to the Saint Valaam. And in his testimony, he told to other Swedish, don't move against Novgorod again with crusade. Yes, and that's very interesting. It's also example of mixed up of different sort of fiction and reality. And one thing that are also interesting, that in this crusade was captured many knights from Sweden, and some of them probably after that, after they returned from capture from Novgorod to the Sweden, they maybe went to Rome or Jerusalem, and maybe they, I don't know, maybe they met up with Boccaccio, and they talk with each other of all those things. And I think that maybe we just must to find more connection between medieval literature of travelogues in Italy, in Russia in this time, because I feel that we must found very much of similarities in that things. Yes.
Right. Yes, in Danuta's text that she sent me, the beginning of it, this is the life of the of Saint Monagonda. The preface talks about how you can't talk about lives of the saints, but life in the singular, because all of us are called to be saints. And the task is that of the Imitatio Christi. What I found fascinating too on the Russian pilgrims is the lantern. This is from the Holy Fire in Jerusalem. It's still carried by plane to Romania, this holy fire, to light the candles in the churches, the Romanian Orthodox, and so forth. And here in Florence, we have the same. In the church of the Santi Apostoli, after the Crusaders came back, they brought the holy flame, and it is taken with the tinder, the flint, and so forth. It is taken to the Duomo, and then it lights the dove, a mechanical dove which flies to the Carroccio, which sets it off with all of the fireworks. And this goes back to the First Crusade, and it's still enacted. It's very, in a way, it's a relation to the Russian and Romanian use of the holy fire, which is from the Holy Sepulchre. And these are sort of these anthropological spiritual strands that reach out. I love being on Mount Sinai with the Greek Orthodox women pilgrims with their staves, and the leader being called Dionysia. Um, this these patterns they're fascinating. They're very powerful. My Roma, they have a saint they adore, Santa Paraskeva in Yash. And if they can't go back to Yash for the pilgrimage each year when she's brought out in her glass coffin, she's from the Middle Ages. She was a beautiful young girl who gave the parents food to the poor. They will touch my computer screen to have the healing from her if they can't journey to her coffin. And then here in Lucca, we have this wonderful saint, Santa Zita, who beats the devil with her broom to save a little boy, and so on, who gives her master's cloak to a beggar who turns out to be Christ. And she's brought out in her glass coffin, and everyone comes and touches it with narcissus flowers, and they walk around Lucca all that day. And these are folk practices. The church is often rather, standoffish about the folk beliefs, but the folk beliefs are of very great strength, and especially where it's an oral culture, it's not yet a literate culture, and so forth. I wasn't able to answer too well what you were saying because I'm hearing impaired, and it was difficult to hear your account. Forgive me. Is there anyone else who would like to chime in? Who else is left?
This is Anne.
Yes. Yes.
Can you hear
And
me? Okay. I just wanted to say that I don't remember exactly when, but the fire that they lit in Santissima Nunziata the evening before, I believe it was the evening before Easter, the Florentines would put their fire out, and then they would go there and have it with something, and it would be relit by the fire of the flint in Santissima Nunziata. I don't remember exactly the circumstances. And then I also wanted to mention that there's that English writer called Jonathan Sumption who particularly writes about pilgrimages, and he mentions things that sort of uh, for lay people, people who don't know about these things, and it's like a first introduction. So he's kind of interesting if you all people are much more sophisticated about this, but I found his book when I was first introduced to pilgrimages rather interesting and enlightening. Do you remember? Do you know
um,
Jonathan
yes.
Sumption?
I'm not hearing you very well. I'm sorry.
Do
Yes.
you? Oh, do
Yes.
you know the book of Jonathan Sumption,
Oh, yes.
the
Right.
author?
Right. Yes. I
Yes,
reviewed it. Right.
yes.
Yes. Yes. I've got it in this library.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. He's a very interesting person. He's a very major judge in England, and who was fascinated with this topic. And I think there is a way in which justice is about equality, but society tends to be a hierarchy, and
Mm,
so that the two clash. And pilgrimage is, in a sense, a trying to right the wrongs of society. Um, and,
well,
and mhm.
excuse me, but if somebody wants to take a walk along some roads that were like the pilgrims followed. There's the Francigena, and that would be there's lots of information about it, and if anyone's interested enough, they can go from Rome to Canterbury.
Right. Yes. 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 Forgive me for not being able to. And who else would like to chime in? Who do we have still? I don't see the faces. How many people have we got? We've got three for chatting, 11 participants. Right, Danuta. Who else can we have chime in?
Julia, can I help you get your gallery
Good.
view set?
Yes, Lara.
I just want to help you get your computer set to gallery view so you can see.
Right. How do I find?
Find the little thing that looks like a tic-tac-toe board that says view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen.
The right-hand corner?
Upper right.
Right-hand
Upper
corner.
right.
Yeah.
Upper right.
Right? No,
Upper.
that's.
It's got 5 dots.
Up the upper right-hand corner.
Yeah, it has 9.
Okay, Vista?
Yes.
Yes.
And then
Okay.
choose
Vista Galleria, thank you, because I want to see you. And,
able to see that.
that's better. That's more like teaching or being in a classroom. But welcome all of you.
Thank you.
So we have some silent people here. Anja.
Sorry about that, Julia. There are a lot of things that have gone through my mind. I mean, I teach engineers, so I teach the cathedrals. And to make a leap to literature, I teach the walk through the cathedral like a pilgrimage, and then it makes sense to the students. It's been very successful. I told you before that I'm looking a lot of often at pedagogical tools with Dante and architecture. I have a question for you. While you were talking about the women and pilgrimage, and here too, I cannot really contribute much. It's just a question. What do you make of the Crusades? I know
the Crusades, yeah.
And I was just thinking of like Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she too she travels with her French husband to the Holy Land, and she is a supporter of the arts, and so I was thinking of her, and if that counts as a pilgrimage in a traditional sense. So what do you make of that?
Yeah.
Where does it find a place in the story of the pilgrimage?
Right. The pilgrimage is really, I mean, Crusades got so corrupted. That's Dante's teacher is conspiring against Charles of Anjou, who is a kind of Trump who wants to sack Constantinople to get rich quick as a crusade, and so on and so forth. So Stephen Runciman, who is the great scholar who wrote the magnificent books on crusades, I heard him speak in Wisconsin. And what he began his speech by saying, crusades is a dirty word. And there he was, the great scholar of crusades, just really loathing the whole way in which is what we're seeing actually now with the Proud Boys and so on and so forth. This St. Bernard is a wonderful figure in Dante, singing Vergine Madre, Figlia del tuo figlio, but he's the one who's preaching the Crusades. And it's about racism and so forth. But what was fascinating was as the Crusaders, wave after wave, got into the holy places, the Holy Land, they assimilated. They became very amicable with the Muslims. And they would keep telling the newest group coming in, no, you don't need to do it that way, with the sword and bloodshed. You make treaties, which is what Frederick II did. He won back Jerusalem for Christianity. while he was excommunicated by the Pope and so on and so forth. So there's a whole lot of ambivalence on this. The Crusaders did think of themselves as pilgrims, but pilgrims had to be unarmed unless they had the arms they had used in the chains that were to fall off. And they were a bit like the English bobby before. I can remember as a child, we respected the police because they never carried weapons. There was a sense of, non-violence. And you gave a pilgrim bread and water and lodging for 24 hours and then sent him on his way. And he could be a holy man or he could be a murderer. But that caring for the stranger because he could be Christ was also, it was there in pagan culture, it was there in Greek sense. Odysseus, remember, comes back disguised as a beggar and so on. It's a very deep sense of hospitality, and which is what we have here right now, and breaking down all of the barriers from so many different parts of the world and so on, which Crusaders tended. The Crusaders originally were the Normans who had only just ceased being Vikings, had only just Christianized themselves, and had this war culture, and then were creating chansons de Roland as part of the Reconquista. And that's the other side of the coin, and it's a difficult one. And it tends to get studied more than, but the soldiers who had to learn how to fight couldn't spend much time learning about empathy, about literature and so forth. They had to spend all of their time figuring out how to wear the armor, the swords, and so on. So you tend to find that their mode of thought is rather superficial, it's narrow-minded, it's easy to get them enthused, and so on and so forth. Whereas I love the text of Mandeville because he describes these other cultures than his own with enormous tolerance and admiration, and which I think is what tended to happen with, well, it tends to happen with us with the Erasmus program, where we meet up with different cultures in the more. Pilgrimage is an open society and crusades ain't. And I think we can say that. And we do have more voices to hear from.
I must say, your anthropological connection was interesting too. Thank you for mentioning that. Years ago, I traveled. I like to travel through Asia, and in Buddhist belief, you walk around Mount Kailash, and these pilgrimages are just extremely powerful. When I visited Lhasa, and people would walk on their knees around the palace of the Dalai Lama. It's just very, very powerful to see the physicalness of such a pilgrimage, which I have only experienced in Asia, actually. Because there's the kind of sincerity there that it's just very touching. And I don't know anything about Buddhist literature to where you would find references to that and how it connects to literature in that sense. So thank you for mentioning that. It was quite interesting to take that little leap here.
Yes, it's in Buddhism, the sense of stripping yourself of all of the
desires, ignorance,
so on, which is what the European pilgrim also does. He just has a scrip and the staff, and but eventually, when he reaches the shrine, he's finally allowed to wash himself and to change into clean clothes. and Compostela, they had this huge censer which still swings, And that was because the stench of the pilgrims who'd gone unwashed, unshaven, and so forth for so long was. Now we need a voice from, yes.
I have a question that I think it's off in a direction you didn't mean to go, but you can tell me what you think when I ask this question. What would you call the people who came to the colonies from England?
Ah, right, yes, right.
And
They were called the
what would you
pilgrims.
call that?
And
Call
right,
that?
and not only that, but the first child born, Guthrie had already had a child born, but the first pilgrim child was Peregrine White, and he was read out of meeting because of the sin of lust. They lost paradise right at the beginning.
So I've been reading a lot of history.
To have a name like Peregrine White and then to sin in such a way that the meeting has to read you out of meeting. He's
Well, I don't think
expelled.
they were so rigid that the
Right.
community, I don't think that they really were pilgrims in the sense.
Well, it was like Adam and Eve sinning all over again. I mean, they lost it right at the beginning.
They lost it before they ever even got here on the boat. But that's
he was born to Susanna White. And when I found that story, I thought, oh, that's a sad one. Now we haven't heard from the one with the bookcase, right? Yes, your name is.
It's Andrew. It's well, in Czech it's Ondřej, but since it's fairly unpronounceable, I think we can stick to Andrew. Well, first of all, Julia, thank you for an invitation, for a brilliant lecture, and for a chance to hear it. Regarding what has already been mentioned, like making pilgrimage as an attempt to make things right, a way of redemption, a spiritual journey. What I have in mind is just like a little footnote, a little entertaining remark. To give you one example of what I have in mind, let me point to a classical piece of the spiritual journey, The Dark Night of the Soul of St. John of the Cross. Now, it seems to be significant how it made its way not only to T.S. Eliot's Four Quarters, but when he speaks of, and I quote, the vacant interstellar spaces, in a direct connection to the darkness, to the transformative darkness St. John of the Cross speaks about. But there's also a thin red line leading from St. John of the Cross to Brian Aldiss' The Dark Soul of the Night, a short novel which playfully turns the message inside out.
Right, because it's really an epithalamium, The Dark Soul of the Night. It's the opposite of what we think it is from the title, just the way Kafka's America is the opposite of what we think. It's a very joyous kind of circus culture, and it's not the horrible, America with the letter K that one sort of envisions it as being from the title. These are texts which do turn themselves inside out. And I loved the way John of the Cross, who was very small, running to the nuns and telling them about what he was writing, great enthusiasm and excitement, and which is, and St. Teresa was calling him, half a monk, and so on and so forth. And but it's my mother foundress adored both Teresa and John of the Cross, and we had all of the texts in the original Spanish and beautiful bound volumes, as well as she translated Teresa's Foundations, and it was wonderful being amongst those books which I now lost and dispersed. But monastic libraries can be fascinating spiritual libraries. And more comments?
If I
Mhm.
if I may,
Yes.
because there's also a telling connection between another pilgrimage, this time the John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and later David Lindsay's brilliant Voyage to Arcturus. Well, at least some commentators think so. So, and that brings me to some kind of a fascinating connection of the medieval Renaissance pilgrimages to contemporary times. Because what about the space travels? It seems to me that the contemporary science fiction is actually a type, or maybe a type, of a contemporary pilgrimage literature. By the way, one of the prevalent motives or subject matters of contemporary sci-fi is that going to space is in fact our fate. So going to space is a way how to make things right, or to do what's in our cultural DNA. So at least that's how the prevalent ethos goes. So, and here's the thought: if pilgrimage in principle is at least like a metaphorical journey across a desert, if it is a journey of transformation, and last but not least, it is a type of a homecoming, right? Going back to God, to a right place, or to a right path leading back to where things were right. So it is a homecoming to an origin. Then the going to space, at least how it is presented in contemporary culture, it is at least latently a type of a pilgrimage, because it shares this dynamic.
Except well, I was asked to write an essay on anagogy for Divus Thomas, which was the Dominican journal, and they couldn't understand it, because in my argument, yes, you have, the literal level, flesh and blood, you have the moral level, you have the figural one, where it's New Testament or Old Testament events mirror each other. But I was saying that the anagogical level really isn't about salvation way off, far, far away. It's that moment when Dante looks at the face of God and he says, Mi pavi pinta delle nostre figlie. He seems to me as if I'm mirroring him. He is us. We are in God's image. When I first read it, I thought, this is blasphemy. And then I realized, no, it's perfectly good theology. This is, we are created in God's image. You remember the sculpture at Chartres where Christ is creating Adam, and Adam mirrors himself. This is mankind. This is humankind. Lenka, could you let us see you and unmute yourself and say something? Or do you want to stay? Can you speak? Do you have a microphone? Or you're just listening? An auditor? Right. Okay. And so I think anyone wants to say something final?
I have one question, Julia.
Yes.
Well, I have lots of questions, but the one that I would like to ask has to do with pilgrimage as exile.
Yes.
And could you just speak about that a bit, please?
Well, that I'm afraid I'm having to go back into the very incarnational aspect of it. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley and I was desperately homesick for England, I'd gone to America at 16 against my will in order for my brother to be able to continue at Shrewsbury. And I'd left school at 16 and so on. And so when I was in this graduate seminar with Philip Damon, who was a very fine, okay, Lenka, we understand and we're very glad you're here. To go back to the seminar I was in with Philip Damon, who wrote a beautiful essay on Ulysses in Dante. I wrote a paper in the seminar on exile. And this was at a time when you were not meant to bring yourself into a literary text. A literary text was meant to be, examined in a white lab coat, separated from Lewis and Tilliard were even debating on the personal heresy. You mustn't talk about the author's life and the author's text. I feel, you cannot separate George Eliot from Middlemarch or any of her books. It would be wrong to do so. It would be wrong to separate Elizabeth Barrett Browning from her writings, from her soul, and so on. So I was seeing, why is it that a scholar named Jerome writes about St. Jerome? We do invest, our work really does come out of ourselves. So I felt it was perfectly all right to write about exile. And then my dissertation director, he said, now, can you write your dissertation on this? And at that point, the exile turned into the theme of pilgrimage. And he said, now, you are taking this seminar in comparative literature, but you are majoring in English. And therefore, you have to have more English texts than non-English texts. So at that point, I chose Dante, Langland, and Chaucer. And then I was able to see all of these likenesses between these texts. And Dante turns his exile into pilgrimage. And this is why when we did the music of the Commedia, I had actually had my Roma restorer create the facsimile of the Libro del Chiodo, in which Dante is condemned to exile and death 3 times. And we've got it in the library. We also made another copy for the Museo a Casa di Dante. And I had wanted Dante to walk in carrying this book, which he then transforms into the Commedia. And it's fascinating that these legal books, leather bound, are the same dimensions as the Commedia and Tesoro manuscripts. And they're written by the same scribes, the notai. So they're from the same world, but they do this metamorphosis from very harsh justice to redemption and so forth. And I was grateful that I had this, in fact, ending up in Florence after the trauma of realizing that the monastic life is the opposite of what it says it is, that I was able to continue with Dante and also with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I was saying today, he was burying his father, and he's from the Belle Arti, and his mother was a teacher of English literature. And we were saying that literature is really our psychiatry. It's about the soul. And this is why you cannot say you must not teach the humanities, you must only teach the sciences. You have to have both, because we are the area in which you are teaching ethics, morals, empathy, humanity. And the word humanities, it's from Cicero, who gets it from Terence, who was a black slave, freed black slave, saying these lines in his comedies, which Dante's son says his father is using for the title of the Commedia. So I think Dante uses Psalm 113, which is a liberation psalm, in Exitu Israel de Egypto, coming out of exile, coming home. I didn't come home to England. I fled England. It wasn't my England. But coming to Dante's Florence was in a way undoing his exile. And I
Yes.
found actually that his fellow student, Francesca de Barberino, came back from exile, and the legend is he wrote out 100 copies of the Commedia. He actually had a group of scribes doing it, and he commissioned the portrait of Dante in the Magdalene Chapel in the Bargello almost the year Dante died to how do you say, rehabilitate this exile in the city of Florence. And this is why I'm hoping we're going to have a meeting on the 12th, that there can be more done in this year to honor Florence, honor Dante in Florence. We're also going to do an app with Renato Stoppani, who does wonderful books on pilgrimage, the Francigena, the Pilgrim Road through France and so forth. We're going to do an app on Dante's Florence with the buildings and so forth, that you can see on your cell phone, tourist. Because this is what tourism should be doing. We should be, I wanted very much to do a series of booklets on Florence's saints. I managed to do one that the courier was not interested, but we did one on Santo Milta, who was, she's a fascinating woman. She's a bit like St. Monagond. Right, more comments? And then we
Thank you.
When is the next meeting?
We didn't set a date. If let's do it the first Tuesday of the next month, February. Does somebody have a calendar?
Yeah, I don't have a calendar open, but so
The first Tuesday, that's the second.
It's second, is it?
second of
Yeah.
February.
Okay. All right, we'll set it for that. And what topic should we do?
Oh, I thought we were going to do the Monagund.
Okay, right. And how can we broaden it to, can we include other women as well?
Well, what we planned to
Mhm.
do was actually talk about that particular text and talk about
Right.
the translation of Egyptian monasticism to the Frankish landscape. So we'll be operating several centuries earlier. We have a text and a translation. I mean, text is only for people who want to.
Yes, I read it, yes.
Essentially in English. There won't be any slides. I mean, this is going to be a discussion of a text that, one reads ahead of time. And we're going to be suggesting various readings, talking about the problems. I'll be doing it with a friend of mine who's an ecclesiastical historian. So we'll have a literary person, philologist, cum historian, and
yes. So could we do that next time, and then the following time? What I would love to do, if it's possible, we've got so many anti-slavery abolitionists buried here. Frederick Douglass visited. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was writing against slavery. And Francis Trollope was writing novels against slavery. Richard Hildreth, women and men. And also Sarah Parker Raymond was studying medicine. She got her MD at Santa Maria Nuova in 1868 with a letter from Mazzini. She was Black, she was American. And I would love to do also, we can possibly have Ijaba Shego, who is Somali, born in Rome, who's written a magnificent novel about Frederick Douglass and Sarah Parker Raymond and Edmonia Lewis. And at one point, the heroine comes into this cemetery. And I would love to do a session on them. And then also, we would like to do a session on the Dante scholars buried in this cemetery, like Joseph Yarrow, who translated the Vita Nuova, the first translation into English, and he was the son of an Indian princess. We have Robert Davidson, who was a brilliant medievalist who wrote volumes on the history of Florence from the archives. We have Russian scholar Kudreshev, who buries his wife here. We have we have a whole group of people, and this will be in celebration of the Dante year. But other topics that people would like to bring in?
Actually, Julia, I just might want to suggest something you might be interested in. This Thursday, our Aranos has a lecture in English on slavery and monotheism. And
Slavery and
monotheism. It's exploring slavery and Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Right. I would prefer to deal it, with the sort of the parameters of Florence, perhaps.
Yeah, no. I thought you might want to go to the lecture if you're interested in the topic. It's going to be online. So, and it's our colleague at Yale from Ancient History who's talking about
So
how three religions cope with slavery.
Yes.
So if you want, I can send you the link.
Danuta, could you send us all that link? Do you see?
Yeah, I can put it in the chat. It's going to be Thursday at, it's at 5 o'clock. Here it is. It's at 5 o'clock on Thursday. Let's see.
Do you want to send it to me and I will send it to our academicians?
I put the link in the chat. It's
okay.
There, if anyone wants to pick it up.
And also, Danuta, would you be sending the text that we're going to read?
We're going to either put it, we'll send it out, or we'll put it a link to a Dropbox.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll do one or the other.
Right.
Yeah. So I'll try and copy this link out of here, because we have this chat when we shut the meeting down.
Right. Yeah, you could do save the chat, I think.
Okay.
You can. It's in the to everyone. At the bottom of the chat, you see the 3 little dots, and then you can save the chat if you want to.
I never knew that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's useful.
Right. A lot of, I should look at, yes, Charlene?
I would like to know if there'll be availability of this recording so we can review it.
I will put it on the website, the Bessarion website. It's http, www.florin.ms/Bessarione.html. And I'm sort of thinking of what we're doing as kind of like a journal with, with essays each month. Bessarion 1, Bessarion 2, Bessarion 3, etc. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to actually express this material, because I'm sort of now, just a custodian of a cemetery. I'm no longer a woman professor in a university with access to other scholars. But I think what I also do is I also transcribe it, because I'm hearing impaired and very often I can't hear your questions. And so if I can hear your questions by listening carefully back and forth, then I can communicate with you what you wanted me to answer. And I've done that in some cases, for instance, with Ryan Pepin, who wanted to know more about the Mare Amoroso in the Brunetto Latino Tesoretto manuscript, which perhaps is Dante's hand. And then I also get them translated into Italian so that they can be shared with Italians as well. And perhaps we might do a different series on the same topics, but with Italians instead of English speakers, so that they will have more spread. This is an experiment, and I'm so grateful that so many are participating in it, because I think given COVID and we can't go to international conferences, that this is, in a way, it's even better.
Yeah.
More affordable.
Yes, it is. That's right. And I'm very grateful for the support that allowed me to have a year of the Zoom. That was great. And so thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Julia.
Julia.
Thank you.
you.
Right. Thank
Bye
you.
all.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yes. And now it should be registrazione in corso.